A Lakota chief's son lay wounded by soldiers. A scarred healer saved him and gained a family. The bullet was still in me when she found me. I know that because she told me later, told me the way she told most things, plain and without softening, that she had almost ridden past. That she had seen the horse first, my paint standing at the creek's edge drinking, reins dragging, and thought, somebody got thrown, somebody drunk or careless. She had almost kept riding. She didn't, and I have turned that over in my mind more times than I can count. The smallness of it, a thirsty horse, a woman who almost didn't stop. My name is Chayton Kills Thunder. My father was Wambly Sapa, Black Eagle, headman of our band. I am telling you this not because the name matters the way a white man's name matters, attached to land deeds and bank accounts, but because you need to understand what I was, what I carried, before you understand what she gave back to me. I was 34 years old. I had led raids. I had sat in council. I had buried a wife and a son, both gone to the spotted sickness 6 years before. I had watched my father negotiate with men who were already drawing up papers to break the agreement before the ink dried. I knew what was coming the way a man standing on a riverbank in spring knows the ice is going to go. You feel it in the ground before you see it in the water. I was riding alone because I had argued with my father. That part I am not proud of. He wanted to send me with a delegation to the fort. He said we needed to talk. I said there was nothing left to talk about, that talking was what they wanted us doing while they moved more settlers in. We said things I won't repeat here. I left camp before dawn, the way a young man does when he's right and knows it and can't stand to look at the face of someone he's also wrong toward. I was heading for the line of hills to the northwest. No purpose. Just riding to ride, the way grief and anger make you want to put distance between yourself and everything that knows you. The soldiers found me at the ford. There were 4 of them. Not a patrol, 3 were drunk, the 4th young enough that he was trying to look like he wasn't afraid of the other 3. I knew the type. I had seen that boy in 100 forms. The one who goes along because he doesn't know yet that going along has a cost. He was maybe 19, sitting his horse badly, and he was the one who looked most afraid, which should have told me something. A frightened boy with a rifle in a group of drunk men is a worse danger than a hostile man, because the hostile man knows what he's choosing. The frightened boy is just reacting. I don't know which one fired first. I was in the water, the paint picking through the rocks carefully, and then there was a sound like the world cracking open, and I was off the horse and the current had me. Cold. The powder runs cold even in late spring, snowmelt coming down from the mountains, and it hit me like a fist. I got my feet down. I got purchase on the gravel. I could hear them on the far bank shouting, the horses shifting. Another shot went into the water 3 feet from my head, and I went under again, let the current take me around the bend. I got to the far bank 30 yards downstream. I remember that. I remember pulling myself up the mud with my hands, the water still running off me, my side already burning in a way I recognized without wanting to. And thinking, you have to get into the trees. If you're in the trees, they can't finish it on horseback. I made the trees. I got maybe 40 yards into a stand of cottonwood where the undergrowth was thick, and then I went down and did not get up again. That is the last thing I remember clearly for a long time. I know that I was on the ground when she found me. I know it was late afternoon because of the light. I know she had her 2 fingers against my neck. I felt that first before I could see anything, and then her voice, which was even and unhurried, saying, "Don't move." I moved. I tried to push myself up, and she put one hand flat on my chest, not hard, but with the kind of authority that doesn't need force behind it. She said again, "Don't move." Her face was close enough that I could see her clearly even through the blur of it. There was a scar on the left side of her face. I noticed this first before anything else, before I had any sense of her age or expression or anything else. It ran from the corner of her left eye down to the jawline, old scar, white against her skin, pulling the skin there slightly tight the way a badly set seam does. She was looking at my eyes, not at my face. She was checking whether someone was home in there. I said something in Lakota, I don't know what. She said in English, I don't know that, lie still, I need to see where you're hit. I said in English, sighed. She said, I see it, lie still. Her hands moved over me quickly, thorough. A person who had done this before. She pressed 2 fingers against the wound, and I felt it in a way that goes past pain into something else, something that makes the whole body respond whether the mind wants to or not. I made a sound I am not going to describe. She said, sorry, just that, not performed, just a fact. She was sorry she had to hurt me to know what she needed to know. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the sky through the cottonwood canopy, the way someone does when they are calculating. Then she looked at me. She said, how long were you in the water? Not long. Can you hear me all right? No ringing. I thought, no. Did you hit your head? No. You're sure? I'm sure. She looked at me for another moment. She said, I'm going to get my mule. I need to get you to my house. There's a bullet in you and I can't do that here. She stood up. She looked at the tree line in the direction of the creek. She said, almost to herself, they won't come in here on horseback. Not into the cottonwoods. And then she walked away. I lay there and looked at the light through the leaves and thought, there is a bullet in me. Somewhere under my left ribs, low between the hip and the last rib. The burning was a fixed point now. Not spreading, which was something. Not spreading meant it hadn't hit anything that would kill me fast. I have thought about that many times since. The way the mind goes immediately to arithmetic even when the body is in the worst of it. The way being a man who has been in situations like this before, not like this, exactly, but bad situations, gives you a kind of cold inventory that you can fall back on. I hurt. I was going to get worse before I got better. I needed someone with a knife who knew what to do with it. I had found that person, apparently, in the cottonwood trees along the Powder River, and she had gone to get her mule. I had no say in any of this. I knew that. The knowing of it did something strange to me, loosened something that I had been holding tight for a long time without realizing I was holding it. I lay there in the cottonwood leaves and let the stranger with the scar handle things. She came back with the mule and a travois that she had rigged herself. I watched her from the ground while she bent the poles and lashed the crosspieces and draped the canvas. She worked quickly and without consulting me, which was the right call. I was not going to be useful, but she explained each thing as she did it, the way you explain to a patient that you're about to do something that will be unpleasant but necessary so that they don't panic. She said, I'm going to need your help rolling onto this. You can do that. Try not to help more than you need to, she said. This is going to jostle. I'm going to keep it slow. Tell me if something changes, if the pain changes quality, or if you start feeling like you're going to pass out, she said. My place is 12 miles. I'll have you there by dark. She got me onto the travois. It took a while. At one point, I was mostly off the ground and mostly on, she said quietly in Lakota. Iyakipi snai. Don't fight it. Stands with horses had taught her that phrase, I found out later. She had a handful of phrases that she'd been given for exactly this kind of moment, the moment when a patient needed to hear their own language. Stands with horses was a practical woman. I stopped fighting it. She told me later that I woke up twice on the ride and fought her both times, and that she had talked me back down both times, and that it had taken longer than she'd have liked. I don't remember this. The idea of myself unknowing and wild, being talked down by a woman I had never met that sat badly on me for a long time, as I said. I have made my peace with it. A man is unconscious or he isn't. The body does what it does. I woke up on her table. I know it was a table because of the hardness of it under me and the height. She had her back to me, working at the stove. The lamp was lit. Outside the single window it was dark. I said in English, how long? She turned around, she said, since the creek about 4 hours, you're in my house. She came to the table and looked at me. "Do you know where you are?" I said, "Your house, 12 miles. She nodded. "Good. Are you nauseated?" "No." "Dizzy?" "No." She went back to what she was doing at the stove. She said with her back to me, "I need to get the bullet out tonight. I have laudanum. I'd rather do it with you aware, but if the pain gets too large, tell me and I'll give you more. I don't know your weight well enough to be liberal with it." I said, "I'll stay aware." She looked back at me over her shoulder. She said, "It's going to be very unpleasant." I said, "I know what a bullet coming out feels like." She held my eyes for a moment. She said, "All right then." She worked by lamplight for 2 hours. I won't describe it in detail. I have enough years between me and that table now that I can describe it accurately, but I'm not going to, because what you need to know about it is what it said about her, not what it said about me. She was utterly calm. Not cold, calm. There is a difference. Cold is a person who has removed themselves. Calm is a person who is fully there and has just taken everything unnecessary out of the room. She worked with small instruments that she had laid out on a clean cloth before she started. She spoke when she needed to, and what she said was always useful. She didn't narrate. She didn't reassure me in words. What reassured me was her hands, which did not shake, which knew what they were doing. She told me where she had learned it the second week, when I was well enough to be curious about things other than the ceiling. She had been a surgeon's assistant at a field hospital during the war, East, one of the battles in Virginia, she said, and did not say which one, the way people often don't name the specific thing that took something from them. She had done this for 2 years under a surgeon named Walsh, who had told her, at the end, that she was better than 3/4 of the men he had trained, which was the most anyone ever paid her, professionally speaking, and which she received with the same composed face she received everything. The war ended. Walsh went home to his family in Philadelphia. She had no family in Philadelphia or anywhere else that she wanted to return to. She had come west because west was where you went when east had nothing left in it for you. When she was done, she washed her hands in a basin and stood at the window for a moment with her back to me, just standing there. Her shoulders moved once, a long breath out or something else, I couldn't tell. Then she turned around and her face was the composed one again, the watching one, the one that had something underneath it that she kept very still. She said, "It's out. You'll live if you don't get stupid." I said in English that surprised her. I saw it, the small recalibration in her face, the reassessing. "What kind of stupid?" She said, moving around, getting up too soon, pulling off the bandage to look at it. I said I had been told I was stubborn. She said, "Then don't be, not this week." I slipped. The first 3 days are not a clean story. They are heat and cold and the ceiling of her house and her hands on my forehead and the smell of the poultice she packed against the wound, which was pine resin and something bitter I could not identify. "Yarrow," she told me later. I kept asking for water. She kept bringing it. I asked her once in Lakota where my horse was, and she answered in English that he was in her corral and eating better than she was. I laughed at that. It surprised us both. On the 4th day the fever broke, and I woke up clear-headed for the first time. The house. I looked at it properly. 1 room, low ceiling, chinked logs, the chinking done well. She had done it herself the previous fall, she told me. A stove at one end, cast iron, the pipe running up through the roof with a collar around it. A table with 2 chairs. Shelves along the entire north wall, every shelf lined with jars and folded papers and bundles of dried plant matter hanging on pegs above, labeled in small handwriting. A rifle over the door, a Winchester, and below it a shotgun on 2 pegs. A window on the east wall with the glass uncracked, which was not something to take for granted in that country. A braided rug on the dirt floor, red and brown and dark blue, worn thin in the path between the stove and the table. A narrow bed against the south wall, mine. A bedroll in the corner near the stove, hers. She had given me her bed. She was at the table when I woke, writing in a small book with a pencil. Her back was to me. Her hair was dark, almost black, worn, pinned up but loosely. A number of strands escaped. She had the scar on the left side, and on the right side her face was regular enough, a strong jaw, a long straight nose, dark eyes set wide. She was not a soft woman. There was nothing decorative about her. She looked like what she was, a person who worked hard and lived alone, and had decided a long time ago that appearance was not worth much of her time. I said in English, "How long?" She turned around. She looked at me the way she always looked at me, straight, measuring, not unkind. She said, 4 days, how's your head? Clear. Good, hungry? Yes. She got up and made me broth from something that had been on the stove all morning. She brought it to me in a tin cup and sat in the chair beside the bed while I drank it. She watched me do it, not hovering, more like a woman who has learned that patients tell you things with how they eat and drink that they won't tell you any other way. I said, "Why did you stop?" She said, "I told you. I saw your horse. You could have kept riding." I could have. Why didn't you? She looked at the cup in my hands. She said, "There's broth left, drink the rest of it." I drank the rest of it. That was how she was. Not unkind, not evasive exactly. More like a woman who had learned to be careful with certain things, who had put certain explanations far enough back in a drawer that she didn't reach for them easily. I recognized it because I was the same way. You lose the people who knew you when you were not yet careful with yourself, and you stop knowing exactly how to explain to new people why certain things stay in the drawer. She checked my wound twice that day. She did it methodically and told me what she was doing as she did it, not to comfort me but because she thought a patient who understood the procedure was a patient who was less likely to interfere with it. The wound was clean, she said. "You're doing well." She said it the way she said everything, without ornament. It was the most satisfying thing I had heard in some time. I found out about the scar on the 9th day, when I was sitting up for the first time and she was changing the dressing, and I watched her face while she worked, and she caught me watching. She said, "It bothers people." I said, "It doesn't bother me." She looked at me sidelong. She said, "You're Lakota, you understand scars." I said, "I understand scars." She tied off the bandage. She said, "Fire." I was 17, our house in Pennsylvania. She said it the way you say something you have said so many times it has worn smooth present tense meaning behind it, but the surface of it flat. My mother got out. My father got out. I went back in for my brother. He was 8. He was in his room. She paused. She rolled the unused bandage in her hands. He got out too. I said, "Then you paid a fair price." She looked at me. Something moved in her face, something I was not yet sure how to read, but I learned what it was later. It was the look of a person who has been given something they hadn't expected. She said, "That's the first time anyone said that to me that way." I said, "What way?" She said, "Like it was just arithmetic, like it made sense. Like the accounting came out even." I said, "It does make sense." She put the bandage on the shelf. She stood there with her back to me for a moment. She said, quietly, "Most people look at me like I should have stayed out." I didn't say anything to that because there was nothing to say to it. Some things you acknowledge by not trying to talk them into something better. She knew I wasn't going to offer her some arrangement of words to make it smaller, and I think she was relieved by that. We sat for a while in the quiet of the house, and she finished her work, and then she went and put more wood on the stove. She turned back around after a moment. Her face was composed again. She said, 2 more days before you try walking. Don't argue with me about it." I didn't argue. I want to tell you who she was, really, because the scar is not the point of her. The scar is just the thing that's visible. What she was. A woman who had taught herself 3/4 of what she knew, out of books and observation, and the slow accumulated instruction of anyone who would teach her, because no medical college in the country was going to train her, and no established practice was going to take her on. She had Walsh's 2 years of field work. She had a library, 8 books, which is not 8 books the way 8 books is now. Those were 8 books that had come across some distance and been consulted until the spines were soft. She had the knowledge of stands with horses, a Cheyenne elder who lived a day's ride away and who had spent 3 winters in trading sessions with Nora, knowledge for firewood, an arrangement that had come to be something more than an arrangement. And she had what a person develops when they have to trust their own judgment for a long time, the ability to see something new clearly, without the distortion of what they already thought they knew. She did all of this for 12 miles in every direction, for white settlers and for the Cheyenne family and for anyone else who came or sent for her. She kept records in that small book, not the names usually, but what she had done and what had happened after, what she had learned. She charged what people could pay. Some paid in food. Some paid in labor. Some paid in nothing, and she let that go without the ledger face that some people make. She had never married. There were no men within reach who had asked. She told me later, and she would not have characterized this as a wound to my face, and in one way it wasn't. She had been all right, truly, the way a person can be all right when they have work they believe in. But I came to understand across those weeks that there was a particular shape of loneliness that she carried the way you carry something heavy that you've been carrying long enough to forget it's heavy. The shape of it was no one who knew her from before, no one who knew her name without her telling it, no one who had watched her become what she was. That's a specific kind of alone, and it gets heavier the longer it goes on. The men in that country found her difficult to look at comfortably. The scar was part of it, but I think more of it was that she was what she was, capable, self-sufficient, occupying her own life fully without looking to be arranged around anyone else. And that made certain men feel unnecessary, and a man who feels unnecessary around a woman will not be generous toward her. I learned all of this in small pieces over 3 weeks, the way you learn a landscape, not all at once, but by moving through it a little at a time, each piece of ground teaching you something about the next piece. On the 10th day I walked to the door and back, 12 steps. She watched from the table with her pencil in her hand and her book in front of her, and she didn't say anything until I had sat down again, and then she said, "Good." She went back to writing. On the 12th day I walked to the corral, slowly, with one hand on the fence for the last part of it, but I made it. My paint came to the fence and put his nose against my chest, hard, the way he did when he was either very glad to see me or hoping for an apple. I had no apple. I put both hands on his face and he let me stand there like that for a while. Nora stood in the doorway of the house, watching. She had her arms crossed and her expression was the one I was learning, the measuring one, the one that was deciding whether to be satisfied with something. I said, "He's fat." She said, "I told you he was eating well." I said, "You feed him grain." She said, "He looked like he'd had a hard few weeks." I looked at her, she looked at the horse. I said, "You feed him grain out of your own supply." She said he was thin. He wasn't particularly. She knew he wasn't. I didn't say this. I turned back to the horse and scratched his ear and thought about a woman who was not exactly flush with supplies who had spent her own grain on a stranger's horse because the horse looked worried about something. My father had always said you could know a person by how they treated animals. He was right about most things. He was right about that. I stayed another week, then another. Not because I couldn't ride, I could have ridden by the end of the 2nd week, carefully, but because I was useful there and I knew it, and because I had not felt useful in a long time. Not that specific usefulness, being able to do a thing that visibly needed doing for a person who was working too hard alone. I fixed the fence on the south side of the corral, which was leaning badly and would have been down in the next wind. I split wood. She had a good quantity, but the pieces were too big for the stove, and she had been making do. I repaired the roof where 2 logs had worked loose over the winter and let in a thin, cold air along the north wall. My side ached doing all of it, but it was a working ache, not a warning one, and she watched me from wherever she was and didn't tell me to stop, which meant she agreed. I also helped with the kitchen garden, which was coming in fast in June, and was more than she could easily tend alone. I'm not a man who gardens as a rule, but there is a straightforwardness to it that I appreciated: the weight of a watering pail, the smell of the turned earth, the particular silence of a task that asks nothing of you beyond attention. She showed me what to do without any condescension about it. She said, "These are the beans, they need the runners tied. These are the tomatoes. These I have no idea what they are. The seed packet just said summer squash, but they're taking over." I tied the runners. The summer squash were, in fact, taking over. We ate together in the evenings. She cooked simply beans and salt pork, cornbread, whatever the garden gave. She had a hand with the garden greens. She did something to them with vinegar and a little fat that made them worth eating, which I had not previously believed was possible. I ate the way a man eats after a long illness, gratefully, past my fill, slightly embarrassed about it. She watched me do this and didn't comment, which was the right call. We talked. Not constantly, neither of us was a constant talker. But in the evenings, when the work was done and the lamp was lit, in the quiet of a house where two people have been existing together long enough that the silence is not uncomfortable, we talked. She asked me about my father one evening. I told her about him. I told her that he was a man who had spent his whole life trying to hold things together that were being pulled apart by people with more power than conscience, and that the tragedy and the dignity of him was that he was good at it, genuinely skilled at the diplomacy, at reading men, at finding the thread of agreement in rooms that wanted nothing but argument, and that being good at it meant he kept trying long after a lesser man would have walked away. She listened with her full attention, the way she listened to everything, not waiting for her turn, actually listening, her eyes on my face. She said, "Does he know where you are?" I said, "By now they'll know I'm alive. The soldiers talk." She said, "You should send word." I said I would. She said, "You haven't." I said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands on the table. She said, "Because of the argument." I didn't answer. I looked at the lamp. She said, not unkindly and not with any implication of judging me, "Chayton, your father doesn't know if you're hurt." I said, "He'll know I'm alive." She said, "Alive and hurt are different things. You know that." A pause. "I know you know that." I looked at her. She was looking back at me steadily, not pressing, just there, just saying what was true. She had the kind of face that could say hard things and have them land as care rather than criticism. I don't think it was something she practiced. I think it was something that had come from years of having to tell people difficult truths about their own bodies, and of learning that the truth was a kinder thing than the softened version. I sent word the next morning. I gave a letter to a trapper named Hooks who sometimes came through on his way north, following the river. I wrote it in English because my father has English, better English than he usually lets the government men know, which is a practical thing. I told him I had been shot at the ford and was recovering. I told him I was with a healer and that I was well. I told him, in 3 short words at the end, that I had been wrong to leave the way I left. I don't know how long it took to reach him. Weeks, probably. I know it reached him because of what happened after, but I'm getting to that. The evening I sent the letter, I came back in from the road and Nora was at the stove. I sat down at the table. She set a plate in front of me and sat down across from me and we ate. I said without planning to, "I'm not good at admitting I was wrong." She said, "I know." I said, "You've known me less than a month." She said, "It doesn't take long." She said it without any satisfaction in it, just a thing she had observed. She picked up her fork. I almost smiled. I said, "Is that a fault?" She said, "It's a trait. Lots of men I've known have it." She was quiet for a moment. "You at least know you have it. That's rarer than you think." I thought about that for the rest of the meal. It was a thing that would have seemed like flattery from a different kind of person, but she was not a flattering kind of person. She said what she observed. If she observed that something was rare, It was because she had looked at enough men to know what was common. Here is something I want to explain about those weeks, because it's not a thing that's easy to explain. I had been a man of standing. I had led men. I had had a family and a role and a place in the world that I understood. And then the sickness had come and taken my wife and my son, and the standing had remained, but the center of it was gone. And for 6 years I had been going through the forms of a man with purpose while something inside me was just quiet. Not healed over. Not grieving exactly, not anymore. Just quiet. An absence where the warmth had been. Those weeks at Nora's house were the first time in 6 years that the quiet didn't feel empty. I don't mean that she filled it. She didn't try to. She was not a filling-in kind of person. But there is something about being with a person who is fully what they are, not performing, not trying to be received in a particular way, that makes the space around them feel real instead of provisional. She was real in a way that most people I had been around for those 6 years were not, or that I had not been able to feel. And the realness of her made something in me start, tentatively, to come back. She didn't remark on it. She probably didn't see it. Or if she did, she understood that remarking on it would end it. Either way, she let me be what I was, not quite right yet, but moving toward it. And she just kept doing her work and feeding her garden and treating my wound, and talking to me in the evenings like a person who found me worth talking to. That was in itself a gift. I recognized it as one. The middle of the 3rd week, she was called out. A settler's wife 15 miles west had gone into a hard labor, and the husband had ridden through the night to get Nora. She was saddled and gone within 20 minutes of his arrival, her kit bag on her back, riding that gray horse named Mule at a pace that did not look like hurry and covered ground very fast. She was gone 3 days. I kept the place, fed the animals, kept the garden watered. Cooked for myself, which I am capable of, though her pantry was organized in a way that took me a while to understand. Everything labeled, everything in a specific place, each category of medicine on its own shelf and the food stores on the shelves below, separated by purpose in a way that was not immediately apparent, but which, once I saw the logic of it, made complete sense. A person who lives alone, and who needs to find things fast in the dark, or in a hurry, organizes differently than a person who lives with others. I found her journal on the 2nd day. I was not looking for it. It was on the table where she had left it, and I did not read it. I set it on the shelf with her books. But I looked at the cover for a moment. A plain brown board cover, worn, the spine restitched with heavy thread where it had been repaired. Her handwriting on the inside cover, which I could see when I set it down. N.M. Voss. The M meaning something I did not yet know. I would find out eventually. Her middle name was Me, after her grandmother, which she thought was a slightly ridiculous name and which she therefore never used. She came back on the 3rd day in the late afternoon. The labor had been hard. A breech baby, she said, which she had turned successfully. Mother and son both fine. She came in, set her kit bag down, and stood at the wash basin for a long time, washing her hands and forearms with the systematic thoroughness she always used, and her face was the tired face, the one I had not seen before, the composed one with all the stuffing taken out of it, just the frame left standing. I put a plate on the table for her. She sat down and ate without talking. I sat across from her and did not talk either. When she was done, she sat with her hands around her cup and looked at the window, at the dark outside. She said, his mother almost didn't make it. I said, but she did. She said she did. Another quiet. She said, I think about the ones that don't. Not in the middle of it, you can't think about that in the middle of it, but after. She looked at the cup. After sometimes they come back. I said, the ones you lost. She said, yes. I said, that's the right thing, to let them come back, not to push them away. She looked at me across the table. She said, you believe that? I said, my people believe that. I believe it. I thought about my wife, my son, the way they came back sometimes in the right kind of quiet. The ones we lost are not gone. They come back to remind us what we're doing this for. She was quiet for a long time, then she said, "My brother died, the one I went in for." Her voice was level. 4 years after the fire, nothing to do with the fire, he was sick, fever in the winter. She looked at the lamp. He was 12. I didn't say anything. She said, "I used to think about that, what it meant. Whether it meant the scar was," she stopped. She didn't finish it. I said, "No." She looked at me. I said, "It didn't mean that. It meant he had 4 more years. It meant the arithmetic came out the way I said it did. You paid a fair price and he had 4 more years than he would have." She looked at me for a long time. She said, "You say things like that and I can't tell if you believe them or if you're just good at it." I said, "I believe them." She looked at the lamp again. She said finally, "All right." She went to bed not long after. I sat by the stove for a while and thought about grief and arithmetic, and a woman who had been alone with both of them for a very long time. In the morning she was herself again, the composed one, the efficient one. She had her garden to tend, and she tended it. She had a settler coming at noon with a bad tooth, and she pulled it with hooks holding the man's arms, and the man making a great deal of noise about something that was over in 30 seconds. She ate her dinner and wrote in her book and blew out the lamp at 9 o'clock. But she thanked me the next morning for what I had said. She said it in passing while she was feeding the chickens. "What you said last night, about the 4 years. She said it with her back to me. "I've been thinking about it, I think you're right." And then she went back inside. That was, for her, an enormous statement. The 5th week, one evening, I was awake late, sitting outside on the step because the nights were warm now and I had been inside all winter. Our winter, I mean. The long winter before any of this. The winter in my father's camp when I had been quiet and useful and empty, and the outside at night felt like something I wanted. The plains in late spring in that country. You cannot understand them unless you've sat in them at night. The grass runs to every horizon, and the sky is bigger than anything should be, and the stars are. I won't try to describe them. Anyone who hasn't sat out in that country at night won't believe you, and anyone who has doesn't need you to. She came out and sat beside me, not because she needed to be there, just because she knew I was there and decided to come. She brought a blanket and put it over her shoulders, and we sat for a long time without talking, looking at the dark line of the hills to the west and the sky above them. She said, "When will you go back?" I said, "Soon." She said, "I know. The kind of quiet that is not empty. The kind that has things in it that both people can hear even though neither has said them." She said, "I don't have anyone." She said it simply, without asking for anything, just saying something true out loud the way you sometimes need to. "I mean, there's no one who would miss me particularly if I stayed here my whole life and grew old here and that was it." She paused. "I don't mean it as a misery. I've been all right. I just sometimes I think about the shape of it." I turned to look at her. Her face in the starlight, the scar catching a little of the light, her hands in her lap not twisted together the way a person's hands are when they're anxious, just resting, just there. I said, "Then come." She looked at me. I said, "My people need healers. We have lost people who knew the medicines. Some have died, some are old. Stands with horses, speaks your name in camp. She has for 2 years. She told my father you were someone worth knowing." I stopped. I started again because the next part was harder to say and I wanted to say it right. "You wouldn't come as nothing. You would come with a use and a place, with people who would know your name after you told it." I looked at the hills. And I am not a young man, and I am tired of being alone in the specific way that a man is alone when he has had a family and lost it. The quiet after that was different from the quiet before. She was thinking. I could feel it, not anxious thinking, not worried thinking. The thinking of a person turning something over carefully, the way she turned things over, looking at each side. She said, "You'd have to tell me when I was wrong, when I made a decision for your people without understanding something. I would make that mistake. I'd walk in thinking I knew something and be wrong in a way I couldn't see myself. I need someone who'd tell me directly, instead of going around me. I said I would tell you. She said you'd have to mean it. I said I mean most things I say. She looked at me sidelong. She said dry, I know. She held out her hand, not across like a handshake. She held it out open, palm up, fingers slightly curved, the way you hold something you're offering or something you want to receive. I put my hand in hers. Her grip was firm, calloused like mine. She looked at our hands for a moment and then she looked back up at the hills. She said, all right. That word, all right. The way she said most things plain without ceremony, like we'd agreed on the best route to take. I understood then, and I have understood it better every year since, that all right from Nora Voss was a serious thing. She did not say anything she didn't mean. She did not commit to things she was going to reconsider. When she said all right, she had already done all the reconsidering alone before you got there. We rode toward my father's camp 2 days later. She had a horse, the gray quarter horse named Mule, who was as stubborn as his name. She packed her medicines and her books into 2 saddlebags and a small trunk that went on a pack horse she'd borrowed from Hooks. She stood in front of her house for a moment before she mounted, looked at it the way you look at a place you've built yourself and lived in alone and that has held you. Not sentimental, just recording. I said, you can come back. She said, I know. She put her foot in the stirrup. I just wanted to look at it a minute. She mounted, we rode. I want to tell you what it was like to ride into my father's camp with her. We came in from the southeast in the late afternoon, the sun dropping and throwing long shadows across the grass. I saw the camp from the ridge, the lodges arranged the way they had always been, the smoke from the cook fires, the children moving in the middle distance, the horses on the picket line. I had not been there in almost 2 months. I had not been there since I rode away in anger before dawn. My father was standing in front of his lodge when we rode in, the way he was often standing unhurried with his arms at his sides, watching whatever needed to be watched. He is a tall man, my father, still straight though the years have been on him, white in his hair, a face that has been weathered into something that is neither kind nor hard but has both inside it. He looked at me the way a man looks at a son who he had not been entirely certain he would see again. He looked at Nora. He looked back at me. I dismounted. I walked to him and I stood in front of him. In Lakota, I said, I was wrong to leave the way I left. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said in Lakota, you were. But you came back. He put his hand on my shoulder briefly, not the way men embrace who have been away, but the way a man touches a son who has been away and is back, solid and real. He looked at Nora. She had dismounted. She stood beside her horse, holding the reins, meeting his eyes without any performance in it, not deference, not challenge, just meeting them. He said in English, because he had decided to use it, this is the healer stands with horses speaks of. Nora said, Nora Voss. My father said, you pulled my son back from the water. She said he did most of it himself. My father looked at her for a moment. Then in Lakota to me, with the faintest dry quality in his voice, she gives you more credit than you deserve. I said in Lakota, she does that. He almost smiled. He said in English to Nora, you are welcome here. The welcome was not simple after that. I want to tell you that because the plain truth of it matters, it is part of what she was. There were people in camp who did not want her there, some because she was white, some because she was unknown, some because they had known healers before, white healers with government medicines, and the memories were not good ones. These were not unreasonable concerns. They came from experience, not from smallness. What I watched Nora do over the weeks that followed was not charm. She was not a charming person in the way that word usually means. She did not make herself pleasant and inoffensive. What she did was simpler than that and harder. She showed up exactly the same every day and she did her work and she made no claims beyond what she could back up and she corrected herself when she was wrong. She asked more than she told. She sat with the older women and learned the language, badly at first and then less badly, in a way that was at least partially comedy, and which she accepted as comedy without embarrassment, which earned her more goodwill than any amount of smooth speaking would have. Stands with horses came to her the first evening and sat with her for 3 hours. I do not know exactly what was said. I know that Stands with horses came back the next morning and told 3 women, in a few clear sentences, that she had tested Nora's knowledge, and that the knowledge was good, and that Nora's heart was straight. Stands with horses was not a person who said things she didn't mean. The 3 women told others. It was not the end of all hesitation, but it was the beginning of the end. What sealed it was Running Deer's youngest. The girl was 3 years old and had gotten a piece of bone from a rabbit, a small thin rib, dried and sharp, caught in the back of her throat. I heard the commotion first, the sound of a child who cannot breathe, that particular silence in it that is worse than crying. By the time I got to Running Deer's lodge, Nora was already there, kneeling with a thin iron probe she kept in her kit, the kind that I had seen only in Walsh's field kit before. And in 40 seconds she had the bone out and the girl was crying, real crying, breath in it, the best sound, and Nora sat back on her heels and her hands were absolutely steady. Running Deer looked at her. Nora looked at the girl. Running Deer picked up her daughter and held her and looked at Nora over the child's head with a look that does not translate into words. Nora just nodded once. That was all. After that, the acceptance was not unanimous. Some things take years, and some things never fully come, but it was real. She had a place. She had people who would bring their sick to her, and who would tell her she was wrong when she needed to hear it, and who would, in their own ways and by their own measures, come to know her. She learned our language the way she did everything, systematically and with the same stubbornness she brought to everything. By the end of the first summer she could do what she needed in Lakota. By the end of the second she could make an old woman laugh, which is a completely different skill from practical communication, and which is, in that camp, the real measure of belonging. I watched this happen. I watched her become a person of that place the way a tree becomes a person of a hillside, not instantly, and with some struggle, and rooted finally in a way that looks inevitable once it's happened. My father watched it too. He watched everything. It was what made him a good headman. One evening in the second autumn we were sitting outside his lodge, the fire low, the night coming in. He said to me, "She is what you needed." I said, "I know." He said, "Not only the healing, what she is in herself." I said, "Yes." He looked at the fire for a while. He said, "Your mother was the same kind of woman." He said it slowly, the way he said things about my mother, which was rarely. Not soft, but present, there for the purpose of it, not wishing she were somewhere else, not counting the cost of being where she was. I didn't say anything. I thought about my first wife, who had been young and gentle, and who I had loved and who the sickness had taken, and I thought about the change in me over 6 years. Not back to what I was before, but to something different, something that had been shaped by the particular grief of losing a family, and then slowly, by the particular return of sitting with a woman who was fully herself and who had decided to be there. I said, "She doesn't wish she were somewhere else." He said, "No, she doesn't." He looked at the fire. "You are a man of this camp again." I had not known, until he said it, how much I needed someone who knew me to say it. We married in the spring. I say married, we did it both ways, because Nora was practical about the government and its papers and knew they would matter eventually, one way or another. The Lakota ceremony first, which Stands with Horses led, and which was the real one. And then, a week later, before a circuit preacher named Colby who came through in May on a horse that looked as worn down as he did. He was nervous about the situation. I could see him deciding repeatedly whether to ask more questions, and he dropped his Bible at the beginning. Nora picked it up and handed it back to him. She said, "The ceremony is the ceremony. Let's just do it." He did it. We were married in both ways. What I want to tell you is what she said the night before the Lakota ceremony. We were outside. Late spring and warm, the air full of the smell of the new grass and the willows along the creek, and something else, something that belongs to that country in that season, and that I cannot name any better than I can name the color of it. The stars were out. We were sitting together with our shoulders touching, which had taken her a long time to get to. She had been alone so long that being leaned on was easier than leaning. And so when she did lean, slightly, into the side of my arm, it meant something it might not mean with another person. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said, that first night on the step, about being alone in the way a man is alone when he's had a family and lost it." I said, "I remember." She said, "I've been alone in a different way. Not the absence of what you had, just," she thought. She picked her words the way she picked everything, for accuracy, the original kind, never having had it to lose. A pause. I had stopped expecting to get it at this point. I said, "Why?" She said, "I'm 32. I'm scarred and strange by most people's accounting. I have lived alone for years doing work that most people in that world either didn't know how to value or found uncomfortable." She said it like an inventory, not a complaint. The arithmetic wasn't favorable. I said, "I told you before, you paid a fair price." She turned and looked at me, close in the dark, her face. I knew it so well by that point, both sides. The one that pulls slightly at the eye and the one that doesn't, the set of her jaw, the way her eyes went very still when she was thinking hard. She looked at me the way she had looked at me that first day in the cottonwoods, when she had her fingers on my neck checking whether someone was home. I was home. I was more home than I had been in 6 years. She put her hand against the side of my face, flat, palm against my jaw, the way she had held it out to me that night on the step. Her hand was rough from work. She held it there. She said, "All right." The same word, but different this time. Not agreement, not the closing of a negotiation, something larger. The word that meant she had stopped counting the arithmetic, that she was laying down the account book, that she was here and present and done measuring whether it added up. I turned my head and pressed my lips against her palm. She made a small sound that was nothing like the composed, careful voice I knew, not watchful, not measuring, not professional. Just there, just the two of us in the enormous dark. My father had 3 more years. They were good years. He saw us settled. He saw the baby, our daughter, who came in the second winter and was born with stands with horses on one side of Nora and me on the other, and who came out screaming with such conviction about the whole project that stands with horses laughed, which was something she did not often do. My father held her. He looked at her face for a long time, the way old people look at new children, that very particular look. Then he looked at me and said in Lakota, "She has your stubbornness." Nora, who had been listening with her eyes closed, said, "I heard that." He laughed. It was a good sound, full and warm and real, from a man who had had a long year and a long life, and I put it away in the place where I keep the things I want to keep. He died the following spring, his heart in his sleep. He went the way a man goes when he is lucky, and when his life has been what it was supposed to be, without the kind of pain that goes on too long, having seen what he needed to see. I grieved him, and I grieve him still. There is a kind of grief that does not resolve, it just becomes familiar. You know where it is, you know what it weighs. You live alongside it, not around it. My first wife, my son, my father, they come back the way I told Nora they come back. In the right kind of quiet, in the smell of a fire, in my daughter's face when she makes a face I recognize as his. I said to my daughter once, she was maybe 3, sitting on my knee while I was beating a piece of leather, I said, "This is your grandfather's design." She looked at it very seriously. She said, in her combination of Lakota and English that she was working out for herself at the time, "Does he know I like it?" I said, "He knows." She considered this. She said, "Good," and went back to watching my hands. "What I have now." A daughter who is 4 years old and has decided she is the head of the medicine bags and takes this responsibility very seriously, which means she has reorganized them twice in a way that only she understands. And Nora lets her do this because she says a person should own their work. A wife who told me last fall, after I had been carrying something too quietly for too many days, that I needed to tell her when something was wrong instead of building it into a weather system, which is almost exactly what my father used to say in different words about a different thing. I don't know what that means exactly. I know what it feels like. A place where I know what I am for. The specific weight of being needed that is not the same as being used, needed by people I belong to, people who would notice if I were gone, people who know my name without being told it. The thing that was taken out of the center of me when I lost my first family did not come back as the same thing. It came back as something else. Something that was shaped by years of quiet and by the particular return of sitting with a woman who was fully herself and who had decided to be where she was. She called it the second life once. She said, "Most people don't get one. You have to know it when it comes. You have to not talk yourself out of it." I knew it when it came. She was kneeling over me in the cottonwood trees with 2 fingers on my neck, checking whether I was home. I am. The stars out here are very big, and the grass is long, and the woman who is asleep in our lodge knew what she was doing when she stopped. She knew it the same way she knew everything, clearly, and without the distortion of wishing it were otherwise. She stopped, and then she stayed. That's the whole of it.